Welcome, everybody. Welcome to your next episode of The Price Report. I am Sam Price, and today we have an amazing guest. We like to bring you traders, people that know about cryptocurrency, devs, and all sorts of information about trading and blockchain. Today I have an amazing guest. He's been trading for 27 years. I would love to pick his brain. I bet you would too. Welcome to the show, Christopher Inks. Christopher, thank you so much for joining me and spending your valuable time with us on the show.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, so, where are you from, number one? Where did you grow up? Are you U.S.-based? Are you down south? Are you northeast? I'd love to know. Just me, I'm from the northeast Boston guy, right? Spent some time in New York City. But yeah, where did you grow up? Where are you from?
So I actually grew up all over the world. My dad was in the Navy. Just kind of lived over in Asia and over here in the U.S. And so now I'm based out of just north of Houston, Texas.
Nice. Okay, cool. That's awesome. And what got you into trading? Like, did you have someone in your life? Was it YouTube? Was it the internet? What got you into trading? How did you get that bug and go for 27 years? I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah, no, it definitely wasn't YouTube. It definitely was the internet. They were not those things at the time. I started back in 95. So it was just prior to AOL's, unlimited dial-up that they had back in the day. Most of the young people aren't even going to know what that's all about. But me, just coming up through school and everything. And as I got into to high school, I just decided that I didn't really want to work for anybody for the rest of my life. I've got this real issue with being told that I have to listen to people that I don't necessarily agree with.
What's your birth sign? What's your birth sign?
Yeah. So I figured there were two ways to do that.
What's your birth sign? I was asking, what's your birth sign?
Scorpio, I guess.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because I'm an Aries and the same. I cannot work for anybody. Yeah, sorry. Go on, man.
Yeah, and so I went through that, and I figured, well, there's two ways to do it. One is to be an entrepreneur and kind of own businesses and whatnot, and then the other way, of course, is to trade. So I figured, why not do them both? And so that's kind of how my thing went. So I've worked very few actual real jobs in my life. I've worked really hard not to have to, even though, you might argue that I work a lot more hours now than I would at that, but it's something about actually working for yourself versus working for others, being able to trade, and it just makes life a lot better.
I mean, I did a night shift for 6 years from like 29 to 34, 35 years old. So and I remember, just dreaming of owning my own business, dreaming of being my own man, dreaming of if someone called me, hey, you want to come golfing at 1 o'clock? And just being like, yeah, move my meetings over. I can do that. You know what I mean? I was always, my two friends, they sold a business, they travel the world, and I was always stuck in a cubicle. So now I am a business owner. Now I made my way through trading. It's hearing your words, I'm like, man, I wish I had bit his bug when I started, but I had to get my butt kicked and go the hard way. But it brings us to kind of, hardworking people. Like, you were hardworking. And when you say I work 14 hours a day now, sometimes 16, when you own your own business and you're a trader, and even if you're trading, your business is in trading, it never stops, because you could put as much effort in. Tonight, you can analyze 10 more charts before you go to bed tonight, or you could go to sleep. There's no end to where you can stop working, and you can hit Sunday night, Monday morning, 7 days a week, 8 days a week, I always say, because there's just so much, you can work from. Is there a certain trade in your life? Like for me, I started looking at Canopy Grow Corp, right? I made a really good trade in that. I was able to, make a substantial amount on that, and then I found Bitcoin. Was there any, and you don't have to say amount or anything, but is there a trade that you remember? I remember Great Panther Limited and Canopy Grow Corp were really no, they were big trades for me that changed the course of my life. I can look back. If those trades didn't occur the way they went, I may not have the capital for the next move that I made. And then everything kind of went on from there,
Yeah, so for me, I started with equities back in the day. That's where I first started. Mm-hmm. And so, I like to tell people, I want people to understand, I'm where I'm at today, not because family had money again, military, it was just, blue collar folks, basically. Mm-hmm. And so when I first came into trading, I made all the same mistakes everybody makes coming in, oh man, I'm going to get rich tomorrow and it's going to be so easy and all this stuff. And so it took me a few years to actually, of making those mistakes before I actually kind of kicked myself in the head and said, listen, if I'm really serious about not having to work for somebody for the rest of my life, I really got to become a student of the markets and whatnot. And so, that was probably about, about 4 years after I really started. So it took me a while to really kind of get in there. But then the one big trade in there was Microsoft trade. So I went long on it up into a pretty good movement. And, that really kind of set me off there. And, it wasn't too long after that we had, the dot-com meltdown and all that. But, so for me, I've been through, the dot-com, I've been through the GFC, I've been through all this stuff that we kind of had, the pandemic and, and then all these various things in other markets. Crypto, I think we go through, it seems like something similar every few years. We get these huge rallies and drawdowns, and it's kind of crazy. But yeah, I'd say that probably that Microsoft trade back then was the one that really kind of stood out.
We have 3 hot topics to jump into: Federal Reserve, we got consumer credit, we got Grayscale ETF and SEC. But before that, man, I consider myself, I consider beginner's mind. I have this awesome quote, like, always consider yourself a beginner, even at the very end of your life. So you'll never say I'm an expert. There's always more to learn,
Yes.
But like, what was it like holding a position or thinking about getting out, and then, or maybe you were already out, but what was it like going through the dot-com? I was alive. I believe I was 18, but I was born in 1983, but I wasn't really getting into stocks at the time. I had no idea, that wasn't even big for kids my age. What was that like? And writing that down, how has that made it easier or harder or different, or maybe it has, I don't know, but how has that affected the way you've reacted to the last 2 crypto crashes,
Yeah, I mean, that's great because, that came there, like I said, that came right after I really kind of started getting really serious about learning how markets move and why they do, and, and how to really trade them effectively. So it was rough. The first one was rough. I mean, that was it. There was a big, a big move down. You've got, what's his name, a MicroStrategy, who was the high flyer in that time, and all but died on the way back down, and then it took him since then all the way up until he really started getting into Bitcoin before his company really started, moving again. And so, yeah, it was a lot of pain back then, but it kind of, that first big, I think the first big one that you go through, especially if you're kind of new, really, if you pay attention, it teaches you a lot. It teaches you a lot about how your emotions tend to drive you. How markets in general are basically emotionally driven. And so, if you don't get an understanding of how and why markets kind of move the way they do, it can be really, really painful. But, having gone through that, it made it a lot easier for 2008. I was one of the guys who was really fearful that we had some kind of big crash coming, mortgages and everything just going crazy. I mean, you see the Big Short, that movie there, Michael Burberry, whatever, they're going on about it and talking about how, all these things were, and this is the same kind of stuff that we were kind of looking at, just in general. You'd see information coming out, but man, when it happened, and, and you got big banks going under, it's kind of humbling at the time there. But, you go through and you make it through and things go on. And then we get to crypto, and crypto, this is like I said, every few years event, it seems like. We get such huge drawdowns, 80, 90, somewhat percent. And it, you've been through it before, so you understand that nothing goes forever. And so you understand that the bottom's going to come in at some point, Yep. So it tends to hopefully hone your emotions more.
Yeah, you have an end, there's light at the end of the tunnel, there's an end at one point, Well, first thing I want to talk about is the Federal Reserve. They just finished, they talked to the House today, they talked to the Senate yesterday. Grueling. I watched all 5 hours of it, every single bit of it. But the Federal Reserve, they don't want to stifle crypto innovation. I noticed that. I really honed in when they asked him a few times. A couple, senators and representatives would stare at him and be like, "Don't we need regulation? Don't you think it would be good?" And he'd be like, "Yes, we definitely." And so what they were doing is, because and I try to tread lightly on it, but what they were doing is, Gary Gensler. He always says that it's regulated. But every time I talk to someone who's high up in a bank or pretty legal, they're like, "Oh, it's unregulated." Even accountants, they're like, it's not, because they don't see the same list of guidelines that they've been dealing with on all the other things that they've been dealing with throughout time. So because of that, there's that, it's smoke and mirrors. And every time they focused asking Jerome Powell that, it seemed like he kind of was, I don't know, poking at the SEC, because he would be like, "Yes, I think regulation is needed. That's what we need." Do you have any, thoughts on that? How deep have you gotten into crypto? And just, the idea of how much are we losing by not regulating? How many people will go to another country because they see that there's innovation there and not here? And, what do you think that does to our economy in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. Great points there. During the last, not the last one, but the prior bull cycle out of the 2018 bear market low there, I was talking about that the next cycle coming up was where we were really going to get a lot of real talk about, Fed coin and, we were going to see the larger institutions start getting in. We're going to start seeing a lot more discussion about how we needed just more clarity in what's going on, right? And so, that's kind of what we got. But now we're still kind of sitting here like, well, what's really going on, right? So you got the SEC over there saying, hey, listen, we've got coverage over this. This all belongs to us. And we're going to keep trying to stretch our hands out and keep trying to get more and more. But at the same time, we're not really going to give you any guidance. But then we're going to take you to court and tell the judge, hey, listen, we didn't give them any guidance, but now they have to prove what we're saying is not true without giving a guide, and so for the SEC, it's a lot of just pushing out there, a lot of just constantly, it believes that it should have this control, but it hasn't actually set anything out. So I think, Powell's correct, man. You got to get it out there, but I don't think at this point, it's a tough thing. So the SEC is an agency, and what it says holds the same weight as, things passed by Congress. But at the end of the day, the same thing, it was the same thing with the IRS, they're going to they're going to do it as property and how they're going to tax it and everything. But I think I've just been a big believer, and I still am, that Congress really needs to kind of come out here and say, listen, this is what it is. Just make a law. This is what it is. And at that point, there is no, there's some sort of guidance, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you want big money to come in, which by the way, if you want Bitcoin to continue rallying higher, you got to have big money coming in. Yeah. Retail's not going to do it.
No.
And contrary to what most people say, it was, back there during 2017, everybody was in it for the tech, right?
Yeah.
Nowadays, I think people are kind of coming to the realization that most everybody's in it for the money. I mean, it's what it is. It's a speculative market. So, in order for that to continue rising, you have to have the big money coming in. The big money needs needs the clarity on that regulation. We don't like it. We don't like to be regulated, but at the end of the day, that's how things work.
Yeah.
So until we kind of get that, a lot of these bigger institutions and whatnot, they've got to, and especially after this last year and all the nonsense with, God, I mean, geez, it just, every time I get ready to talk about it, I got to take a minute just because of all the greed that went into that and how it just kind of spiraled out of control. FTX, Voyager, Celsius, 3 Arrows, everything. And so that on top of not really having any clarity already really makes it difficult for big money to come in, but big money wants to come in. They want to, we saw it, people want to get in, but I think Powell's right. You need to have some sort of clarity. So whether it's going to be by the SEC or my preference would be just for Congress to come out and say this, and then we can work from there. And I think it'd make things a whole lot easier for the rest of us.
Yeah. That's great points. What really got me, sad too was when you see regulation, you see all that, and at the end of the day, they're even right now they're going to pay back debtors or banks, but like those are the people that didn't get the money too. Like after all this happens, like the money doesn't, it's like harder to get the money back to the actual account holders too. Like it seems like all the other insurance companies get their money first. Like all the big boys seem to get their hand in the cookie jar, and like there's just really like, if you ever do get anything back at the end of these like bankruptcy proceedings, like it takes like 7 or 10 years and people get like pennies to the dollar, and it ends up really, really hurting retail to the point of no return, and what I didn't understand too was, you have Alex Mashinsky, right? I always somewhat mess up his name, but he's a billionaire. So you're thinking, why would he scam people? Like, why would he run something that you know what I mean? Like I was naive to think that, and I didn't put my money into Celsius. I worked too hard. Like we were talking before, I worked the night shift for years. Like, and I grabbed Bitcoin, 500 here, 1,000 here. And like, it was, sometimes I only had $1,400 in my bank account and I bought $500 worth of Bitcoin or $900. And I waited for the next week and I ate like eggs or I bought pizza dough by the bag at Costco's and I only made pizza. Like I made it happen so I could buy those Bitcoins. So once I saw, hey, you could just put your Bitcoins in stake, I didn't trust it. I thought, man, what if I press the button and I never get it back? But I did think, oh, he's a billionaire. Like my money's probably safe there. It's just, you never think a billionaire would be the person that would end up robbing you. You know, it's really weird to me.
Yeah, man, it was crazy stuff. Yeah, I mean, I remember somebody had asked me one time on one of our live streams about, well, so which one are you going to put your money in? It was like it was like a year prior around May or something to everything happening. And I was like, there's no way I'd put anything in it. I said, these kind of APYs that they're kind of telling you here, there's no way this is sustainable. And I actually said, what's going to happen is when the market finally turns down, there's no way they're going to be able to pay us back. And you're going to see this big thing. And at the end of the day, you, the retail investors putting your money there, are the ones that are really going to be sucking wind on this. And
the only money in there is going to be yours. Yeah. You know, there's going to be nothing. Like, it's like everyone was thinking they were getting money from this entity. And then when it goes down, it's like, no, the only money ever in there was actually your money. Like, there was no real money in there. Like, it's so crazy, man.
It's tough. It's tough.
Well, brings us to our next article and our next topic here, which is, you know, the consumer. That always seems to get hit. You know, savings have been squandered. And I studied this. You know, I studied inflation in 2010, 2012. And, you know, men older than me and historians and people that I was reading were saying, hey, you're going to get punished for savings. What will happen is the interest rate will go down so low that no one will make any money on their savings. You know, if they keep bringing the interest rate, and that's what happened. We almost had zero borrowing rates, right? Yep. And it was great for people that could borrow money and access money in business. Institutions, large real estate corporations, they could just grab money hand over fist. They were almost getting like thrown money. Like they had to take the money. Like people were like, you have to take this money. You know, and it's almost like, I remember talking to guys like, I got to take $1 million loan. Like I got no choice. And it's like, you know, and then there was poor people that like didn't understand any of these concepts, and their savings were just getting completely obliterated because when you lower the interest rate, you know, back in the day, you know, they would raise the interest rate, right? And yes, it would stifle the economy, but you had a lot of people who held savings. So when a lot of people held savings, it would actually, you know, reward people who were saving. So it would, in turn, they would gain some equity on that and then spend that money when we kind of balance things off a little bit and spend it even then in the economy, and it would give a little stimulation. Now no one has savings, so when they raise the interest rate, it doesn't, you know what I mean? There's no reward for that to the average American person. And what happens is we end up just punishing the saver. Like there's really no point to save. So they flush everyone into the market. Now they start selling off assets because they did quantitative easing and they crushed the market. It's like they're making it very hard for the average person that doesn't understand like quantitative easing. You know, why is the dollar index moving up? What is Bitcoin? You know, almost understanding what Bitcoin is almost imperative to being able to survive in today's world markets, you know?
Yeah. You know, economics is not called the dismal science for no reason, right? I mean, it's a tough thing. You know, you've got world-class economists who constantly get it wrong. And I always talk about this. There's a lot of moving parts, right? And even as economists, we still a lot of times are driven by our own personal biases, right? And so we ask questions that we hope can be answered in the way that we're looking for them to be answered. And as much as we try, we still fall into that, right? And so, you know, when you look and you go, okay, well, we see this is going on, so we should be doing this. Well, yeah, but at the end of the day, the basis is, okay, we're a debt-based economy, so we need some kind of inflation, period, end of sentence. If we get deflation, all of a sudden today's debt becomes more expensive in the future. It becomes really difficult to pay. So you need that bit of inflation to keep making that debt cheaper as time goes on. Okay. Obviously, if you get too much, well, then, you know, of course, you get everybody going, well, what the heck? You know, we can't afford this. We can't afford that. They got to pull back in there. But it's such a big thing, especially today where everything is so interconnected globally, right? Even our financial systems. And, you know, we look back, you know, the world's reserve currency is the USD today, but it's been since 1950s. It's not been since the Bretton Woods. It's been since 1950s. You saw it was like a dual USD and gold were like the reserve currencies of the world through, you know, Bretton Woods. And then, of course, you know, basically became the USD. And so you look at it, okay, well, we look at what the Fed's doing today, and we say, okay, well, you know, the Fed's like, okay, we've got all this runaway inflation, we got to cool it down, so we have to raise interest rates. And then we look at what you're talking there, which is where you see that consumer credit it appears to be topping out, right?
Yeah.
Now, the one thing I want to say about that is, you know, as they mark in the article there that we were looking at, a lot of that stoppage has been with the large purchases like homes and stuff like that. Now, here's the part where I said there's a whole bunch of moving parts, right? So we might have had what might have been a one-off in January, you know, in the previous employment, the huge employment spike, and then the huge CPI run up, right? Compared to what it had been, everything had been trending down, but then we had these big moves there. You know, seasonality, maybe a few other things in that. But if it's not a one-off, you know, all of a sudden that means we've got more purchasing power still coming in the forms of people, right? And so we say, okay, well, but credit looks like it's topped out. So what's going on there? Well, if credit's topped out, the reasoning being housing, for instance, which is what they seem to be saying. Well, it looks like housing may have bottomed out over the last few months.
Yeah,
and we know that when you have when you have this recession coming in, right? Usually it starts off with housing, right? Because mortgage rates are really sensitive to the Fed funds rate.
It's the first thing. It's the largest thing that can get affected gets affected. Exactly. Yeah.
But then, you know, your builders usually lay off construction workers, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And then, you know, you lay them off, and then that also has effects on you know, has like a compounding type effect,
he doesn't
right?
Go to the restaurant, or he doesn't tip the waitress, and then she gets laid off because they need less waitresses at the restaurant, and then just, you know.
But what has happened here? Not only did the builders hold steady, they were like hoarding their workers, right? Even though the prices were coming down and the housing was slowing, hoarding workers, because it seems like they're fearful that if a bottoming is going to be happening here, that they're not going to be able to get them back. So they've been hoarding them, and we even see an uptick recently in hiring for construction.
Sounds like you build homes.
What?
Sounds like you build homes for a living. I was just messing.
No. But you know, when we're looking at this, we go, okay, well, if this is going on,
no, it's great insight. It's great insight.
Yeah, you know, so what does this mean? Well, so the consumer maybe nearing a top out there with that credit, but man, if housing picks up again, and you know, again, we've got the lowest supply of housing since 2002 or 2022, I believe. I think we had about 7.9 months.
Well, because people couldn't build anything too, like, right? During the pandemic, I still know people that can't get garage windows, or like a hinge can't come, or they're just waiting on a part, or it just seems harder to get things than it was ever before.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. And so we've got all that going on. So what if this is, you know, they did right, they hoarded the workers, and all of a sudden, you know, it picks up again, and, you know, we still have this ridiculously low. I was one of the guys that said, man, when we hit 3.6%, you know, more than a few months back, I was like, man, usually historically around that 3.4, 3.6% unemployment rate usually marks where we get a reversal, and, you know, you start unemployment starts kicking in. But we're not seeing that, right? Then we drop down to 3.4. So, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts going on right now. And if we look at what's going on now we've got Asia coming in, and they're, you know, deploying all this money, you know, into the global liquidity. So the Fed's over here saying, okay, well, we're going to tighten, right? But at the same time, this has got reverse repo jumping up there. It's still near the highs.
Yep.
And then you've got Asia, you've got People's Bank of China over there. You've got the BOJ, you've got them all, you know, injecting money in. They're all easing. You had, what's it called? UK had to do it there when they almost had that pension issue. And so you've got all this going on. So yeah, the US may be saying, okay, well, yeah, we're kind of trying to dry up the dollars out there. But at the same time, the dollars are basically what greases the wheels of the entire international commerce, right?
Yeah.
So the Fed can't do too much of it to where it hurts the rest of the world, because then that comes back and hurts them.
You can't take the oil out the engine and then cease the V8. Like, it's not going to, you know, everyone is using the dollar, right?
Exactly.
That's why it's funny. I get these, you know, it's funny you say this, because my wife, right, we're looking at homes in Florida. We're thinking of buying, right? We want to move out of cold Boston and go down to Florida. And we keep looking at homes. And every week, 20,000, 10,000. She'll be like, this house is down again. This is the first week that she's like, this house is now the house is now up 5,000 from what it was 2 weeks ago. It's the first 2 weeks that since she's come to me and told me housing prices in the last 6 months, that the housing prices are starting to rebound again, right? You know, and it's slight. I don't know if this could be a, you know, dead cat bounce for now, but, you know, and it's interesting how much my knowledge of trading stocks has made it a little, I'm not saying I'm an expert, but it's made it easier for me to know when to buy a home. Because I look at a house and I can see, oh, that's an overbought coin. Like, everyone's getting in right now. I can't buy that now. Like, I have to buy it. You know what I mean? So I'm in like waiting for this perfect time. But you also don't want to, and then eventually I also just want to enjoy your life. You know what I mean? And find that balance. This is great, man. You're so insightful too. And yeah, the Asian markets employing liquidity into the world market And because, I mean, I always say this too. I was at some UN summit. I used to be a cameraman. I'm at a UN summit. It must have been 2014. No, I'm going to say 2012. And someone handed me a pamphlet called BRICS, right? And I'm like, what is this? And he's like, you got to learn. This guy in the 1970s was telling us, and like, he was telling me about some, I don't remember the guy's name, but, you know, a different economist that was, you know, like a congressman or a senator in the United States. And he's like, you know, you got to hear about BRICS, this thing about BRICS, da, 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 da. And it was, you know, Brazil, Russia, I believe, in India, China, Syria. And they're basically they want to basically make their own economy, right? And maybe find, you know, one of their currencies to become the main currency and battle the petrodollar, right? So, yeah. And that's been brewing for a long time. It seems to me it's only a matter of time to maybe that comes to a head. I don't know. You know, those are bigger, you know, issues, and you have the U.S. military and other things going on. But yeah, I just try to tell people about BRICS because like I knew about it and then didn't hear about it for years, and now I'm hearing about it again, and I'm like, oh my God, I remember when someone first told me about BRICS.
Yeah.
And that brings us to our last segment, which is Grayscale. Last thing we want to talk about here is Grayscale appears to win against the SEC, possibly, you know what I mean? If everyone doesn't really know, they were trying to make an ETF, right, out of their fund. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to make an ETF out of their fund. For some reason, you know, every once in a while, you know, there would be another ETF, but they couldn't get approved. And it went over and over again. So they finally just said, hey, I'm going to sue the SEC. Why am I not getting approved? The judge asked a few questions that may have pushed the SEC onto the having to be kind of on the defensive. And it looks like there could be a little light at the end of the tunnel, a little bit of smoke and mirrors on the article. But, you know, despite the article, your thoughts on this idea? You know, should they be an ETF? How will that affect Bitcoin? Have you seen bigger ETFs in your life as a trader affect market prices? And is that something that is a traditional move that we should expect moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I still believe that you know, if we can get a actual spot Bitcoin ETF, I think it's got potentially a lot of huge positives for the market, for just cryptocurrency in general. Because again, you know, those of us that are in it, you, me, everybody else, you know, we're all used to the wallets and everything, and we still check, you know, the wallet address 58 times before we actually send something, and then we pray it gets there, right? So, you know, we got a long way to go kind of making ease of stuff like that. But, you know, we're in this world and you know, it's around us all day. And so these things that we take for granted that it's just the way it is, and it's everyday thing that we become used to, are actually the things that are holding back a lot of people from getting into it. And so, you know, the ETF gives people the ability to get, you know, exposure to Bitcoin without actually having to buy Bitcoin. The people are comfortable. You know, at the end of the day, these big shops, these big companies, they're still run by old men that have done things the same way for decades. Even the young men coming in are often trained by the old men, so they continue the same thing, right? So it's where are they comfortable with? And, you know, it's a lot more comfortable. They understand ETFs. They may not understand Bitcoin, but they understand ETFs. And so I think, you know, if we can get something like that, I think it'll be a huge boon for the cryptocurrency market. But, you know, the question is the SEC going to actually get around to, again, you know, kind of giving some sort of guidance so that, you know, people go, okay, well, if this is what we need to do to be, you know, to be an ETF, okay, well, let's do it. We'll do it. You know, and then that money, you know, just has such an easier route in than trying to get off onto this quirky little asset that, you know, that's kind of off right over here somewhere on the edges, on the fringe, you know, as it's kind of looked at.
I had like an epiphany. I'm going to try to talk about this metaphor, but I had an epiphany where it's like, there's like, I don't know, there's like, say there's like a king and there's like two underlings that are going to go up to the next position for the king, right? Like they're like somewhere in the court and they both are trying to like please the king and do certain things for the king, right? Now, if one knew a certain thing that would lose him power, he wouldn't want the other guy to know, like, oh, I do these certain things and that helps, you know? And it kind of, and I'm not making the best metaphor, but it's like they already have control of a monetary system. They see this new threat coming in and they're like, why would we give anything to it? So they don't want to regulate it, because if they regulate it, they give up some control. And we just know that they don't want to give up the control. So like, I see right through it. Like, I'm like, that's what it is. I mean, you got guys who make money because they control, you know. Everyone forgets when we say government, when we say business, Like, it's a human being. Like when we say General Motors, like it's a guy in a boardroom making decisions with another boardroom.
Right.
And I mean, governments and businesses, they become an entity at one point. Like people go through the swinging door and the entity exists. But it's funny. We say government like it's a brick wall. Like, you know what I mean? Even I used to do it. I said government. Like, in my mind, I close my eyes and I just see this inanimate object. But like, it's not. Like, it's living, breathing people. That's why when people listen to whatever the government says, I'm like, that group of people will change in 7 years. And that could just be a bunch of people throwing their will on you. Like, that's not the government. That's whoever happened to transient into the voter box and got themselves with whatever money that was behind them, whatever big business that pushed them in. Yeah. A lot of people are kind of like, they're not, I'm not saying they're nobodies, but they're like, you know, someone independent, have a little bit of a voice, and they get a phone call. And the guy's like, hey, you know, like, and they go to some dinner, and next thing you know, they're getting courted, and their life's different now. And, you know, they get a little, that to some people, that gets them easily, you know, fluttered. And, oh, now I'm important. Next thing you know, and it's sad because that's the type of person that will easily lie or just do whatever it is. Because once they lied to that point or just kind of like let themselves get swept up, they're in control of someone else and someone else's destiny, someone else's money, you know. And I bet that's like half of the people we see in Congress today, you know.
Oh, yeah. No doubt. No doubt. I mean, you know, one of the greatest things one of my tax professors ever said in law school was that they said, hey, listen, you know, they make the same kind of point, you know, that everybody talks, he's talking about the IRS in particular. He says, everybody talks about the IRS and how the IRS is doing this or that. He says, but at the end of the day, IRS is just a bunch of people. And most of them don't really have anything against you. They're just going in, doing their job, going home. But then when you get to that point where you get to those upper echelons of power, like you said, you should get into senators and whatnot, stuff like that. Well, all of a sudden your power becomes, you know, quite, I don't want to say absolute, but it comes quite strong, right? And so, you know, absolute power draws to it those who intend to use it, right? I don't necessarily believe that power corrupts. I just think that power is going to draw to it those people who intend to use it. Whatever they do ends up being positive or negative for people.
The universe gives you whatever you want. Yeah, they don't become powerful because they didn't want to become powerful. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Those that don't want it,
they drew it into existence for sure. Yeah,
exactly. So then, like you said, they get in there, they get lobbied. All of a sudden, they feel powerful. They have power, you know. And you know, do you just step away from that? No, you know. Even if you want to yourself, who are you beholden to now? You know, there's a lot of that going on in there. Sure.
Yeah, it becomes like where's my loyalty? Where you know, and that's the thing. I mean. Too many, you know, I was raised, like my dad sat me down and he said, listen, you're Samuel Price. And he said, that's the name I gave you. And don't do anything to ruin it. You know what I mean? It's not worth millions of dollars. Nothing is worth more than your name. And like, that has got me through a lot of things because there's, you know, people have dangled things in my life here and there. And I've been like, no, like, or I've been halfway into something and I realized, no, like that's not going to work out. And I've been able to consciously assess the situation. And, you know, be able to basically always know what the right thing to do is based on my legacy. Like, I've chosen a legacy. Like you said, like, I've chosen a legacy, right? That's what I wanted to choose. Like, if some type of power comes from that in and out, okay. But I want people to remember me just like they remembered Mark Twain or someone else. Like, I just want to be, hey, that person gave something to the society and cared, you know? You know, if you have to get wealthy to do that, whatever happens, if that's part of it. But it's like, I learned through the battle of trading that you'll get whatever you focus on the most. For instance, like if you trade stable coins and you want to make 100 grand and that's what you focus on, then that, you know, hopefully that will in turn happen. But say you want to just hold BTC and you want to trade 10 Bitcoins to 100 Bitcoins and that's all you do, like, and you only trade BTC pairs. Like you'll get whatever you focus on the most, you know what I mean? If you do both, then you'll get like maybe 50 Bitcoins and you'll get half of each, you know? But if you focus, you're centered, you know, your true focus and desire on something and you hone in with everything, you have a raised frequency and you begin to really pull things into your life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so yeah, you're right. It's like, I just was like, cause you get confused with like, what do I want to truly pull into my life? Do I want to be a multimillionaire? Like, do I want to be like, what is it? And so I told myself legacy. And if I make legacy the number one destiny, then like everything else should pan out pretty well. Right. Because you'll make decisions in a ripple effect idea that hopefully what you do today will be remembered later on. You know what I mean? And I get that vibe from you, man, looking you up and just kind of going through like kind of the way you approach yourself and market yourself a little bit. I get this, I don't know, a worldly guy who's been through a lot, who understands kind of the energies of the universe. Even like, I love your painting behind there. It's got these colors, it's got some essences. I got the bull in there. But there's like an artist thing to you. You said are you a lawyer? You said you went to law school.
I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
I have a law degree. I completed law school. I'm one of the very, very small, weird group of people that actually went to law school just to get a real, from the mouth of what's going on. How does it actually work? I had an idea before I went in, and then going through it really expanded, really made me understand just how gray the laws are, and just how it's general people. If you haven't been to law school, you kind of go, man, that doesn't make no sense. That looks like just like that, and there's no reason they should have ruled differently. But once you've been to law school, you understand. Okay, well, one was this way. This case had these other things here. So when we talk about that other SEC article there, with the Grayscale one.
Yeah.
And talking at the end there, it says, or, they could just send it back and they could go back into the whole Bitcoin rejection cycle again, just with a different argument, a different thing. And that's really all law is, right? There is nothing that's definitive in law. Murder is not just murder. There's murder and as self-defense. There's murder as in a heat of the moment. There's, and so this is the way it is with all the laws. There's always other circumstances that kind of put itself in there. And it makes it really difficult for the rest of us out here. If you don't know much about law, whatever, and you got these people making laws and doing all this, and you think you're protected, and then you're not, or you think that something should happen a certain way, and then it doesn't, because, that's just the way law is, right? And so it can be a really crazy thing. It can be really difficult for people in general. It's just, there's so many bad things about the way law is done here in the U.S.
Yeah.
But, at the end of the day, especially when it comes to Bitcoin and I think anything with it's financially related, I think you have to have some sort of regulation. You have to have some sort of boundaries. You have to have some sort of setup that says, listen, if you want to play, here's the rules.
Yep.
And then let the people still play. They won't not play.
Yep.
They'll play.
Yeah.
But as long as you got this nonsense that the SEC has been doing, again, and just saying, well, we're the SEC, so what we says goes.
That's it.
But by the way, we're not going to tell you what you need to do here, but now we're going to sue you because you didn't do what we didn't tell you shouldn't do, or something like that. It's just craziness.
Like, how do I comply when you don't tell me how? You know what I mean?
Exactly. Exactly.
Man, this was an amazing conversation. You had a lot of good insight just about what's affecting the U.S. economy, like more than just the U.S. dollar. There's so much more at stake. Even mentioned Bretton Woods a little bit there. If people want to Google that and get into that, in New Hampshire, where we really got off the gold standard. It was in 1971. Am I correct?
Yeah, 71, 73, right around there. Yeah,
somewhere right in there. It goes, if you want to read another book, right? Was the Monster on Jekyll Hyde or Jekyll Island?
Jekyll Island.
Yeah, that's another good one that will kind of lead you down. Another great movie is Money Masters. I tell everyone to go watch Money Masters. It just kind of lead you to you'll find out we had colonial script in America. We had our own form of currency at one point. We printed the continental dollar to zero. Just things that you could find out a lot more about the history of our currency when we first started and how we kind of led into where we are today. The greenback dollar, which I didn't even know about, which lasted till 1971, that was created by Abraham Lincoln, and all sorts of fun historical facts of that nature. But Chris, I'm gonna have you back on, man.
That's awesome.
We're gonna have to have another type of show. And I would love to just sit there and pick your brain too one day. I might even just look you up and take one of your classes and find out more about you, man. I know there's always more to learn, and I'm still beginning in this trading journey. So thank you so much for coming. Please tell people where they can find you. If you have a Twitter, if a YouTube, if, whatever you do, and just give people a little bit about yourself and where they can find you, and leave us with some parting words. And I'm done for the interview. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, man. Yeah, I appreciate it. Most of the, we try to put on multiple social media presences, but mostly out there on Twitter, TX West Capital. And then YouTube, you can find us there at Texas West Capital on YouTube. And that's pretty much the big place we go to. We're on twitch.tv/Texas West Capital as well. Facebook, Texas West Capital, Instagram kind of thing. Trying to kind of pump up those other ones, but man, oh man, most of it happens there on Twitter. Most of it happens there on YouTube. But man, just trying to distill what I've learned over the years. It's been a lot of money lost, a lot of money made, a lot of mistakes made over the years, just to kind of get to this point where I'm at today. Unfortunately, new traders are going to come in and be the same people that they always are for 100 plus years, I was the same person I was when I first came in. You know, there's a lack of humbleness out there. You know, if you're not consistently profitable today, understand that you're still starting out, and that's okay. It's not a bad thing. I've been doing this for 27 years. I still try to learn something new constantly. Like you were saying, man, you know, basically when you start thinking you're an expert, that's the end of the line. You start falling backward at that point. There's always something more that you can learn out there. Don't ever think that you can't be taught something. So, you know, that's kind of just the way I approach life and the way I approach trading, and hopefully help others to do the same as well.